have to relearn to walk and talk. The recovery can be slow and uncertain. We know the faster we receive treatment, the better. Now, Perth scientists believe they are on the verge of what's being described as a potential global wonder drug. Dr. Liz Dallimore is a neuroscientist and managing director of biotech company Argenica. I hope I've pronounced that correctly, Argenica Therapeutics. Welcome, Dr. Liz Dallimore.
Thanks so much for having me, Amber. And yes, you have pronounced it spot on, so well done.
I didn't check. I just had that moment of horror. I usually check. There are different types of stroke. There are different types of stroke as well. Can you describe what happens in an ischemic stroke?
Yeah, sure. So an ischemic stroke is the stroke that is caused by a clot in a blood vessel in the brain. So this is different from a hemorrhagic stroke, which is a bleed on the brain. But these ischemic strokes, these clot-causing strokes, make up around 85% of all strokes. So even though these two different types of strokes present in the same way, it is these ischemic strokes that are the most prevalent. So what happens when you get a clot in a blood vessel in the brain is it stops blood flow to that part of the brain. And the brain cells can only last about 3 seconds without the sort of the nutrients that blood is providing and the oxygen that blood is providing. So you get immediate cell death that happens in that vicinity, that sort of area of where that clot is. And we know then from that point, and I think you mentioned in your intro, that time is so critical in stroke. And that's because that initial bit of brain cell death actually starts to proliferate out through the brain. So we know that around 1.9 million brain cells die every minute that clot remains in that blood vessel. So huge amount of brain cell death going on, which obviously then later on is presenting itself as those functional disabilities that you see in people that have suffered a stroke, unfortunately.
So are those the earliest symptoms of it, the facial drooping and what I mentioned, or is there a headache to go with it? Any kind of earlier warning there?
You know, for a lot of people that I speak to that have suffered a stroke, it really is those motor type of things that are, you know, the initial thing that presents itself. So a lot of stroke sufferers say that, you know, they're fully present, they're fully aware, and it's not until they see, you know, they go to reach for something and they realise that their arm isn't moving, or even when a loved one sort of comes into the room and sees, you know, that telltale sign of that face drooping, because it's not actually painful in terms of the stroke itself. Generally, it's presenting as some sort of obviously functional deficit in the body.
Whereas the hemorrhage possibly might be more painful, I sense.
Exactly,
yeah.
Yeah.
Why have strokes been so difficult to treat quickly?
So any neurological condition is quite difficult to treat. The brain is obviously a very complex organ, and when you have something like a reduction in blood flow, it causes all sorts of things to go on in the brain. So really what we're trying to do at Argenica is to address that brain cell death, that brain injury that happens post-stroke. This is a very complicated physiological process that happens, and previous research has shown that having a drug that just sort of targets one of those areas isn't going to work. So the benefit of our drug is really being able to have a multifaceted, multi-mechanistic way that it works to address a number of these things that are happening in that ischemic brain, that sort of brain cell death.
How does it work? Can you explain that?
I can, yes. I can
in a way that I might understand.
In layman's terms, yes. So really what we're trying to do with this drug is to hibernate the brain cells. So on brain cells, they're called neurons. You have little channels on the cell surface that let different types of things come in. So calcium being one of the main things. In a normal brain, you've got the same amount of calcium that sort of sits in and outside the brain. It's very, you know, homeostatic, and it just sits there quite happy. When you reduce that oxygen to the brain because of that reduction in blood flow caused by the clot, calcium starts to rush in through all these different little channels, iron-gated calcium channels that sit on the brain cells, and this causes these brain cells to die. You also get inflammation that starts happening around the brain cells in that initial area of brain cell death. You get cytokines, toxins, all sorts of things. So our drug is trying to work on that initial blocking those channels, that calcium influx into the brain, but also working on the inflammation, working on that sort of cytokine storm you see from the inflammation, and really just hibernating those brain cells to buy them time to get that patient to hospital and to get the treatment they need to remove the clot.
It's being trialled in hospitals around the country. How will it be administered?
So the drug is administered through intravenous infusion. That is pretty typical for stroke patients coming into emergency departments. They tend to have an IV line in anyway for a saline drip, that sort of thing. So a pretty standard of care administration. The best thing about delivering a drug intravenously is that it gets into the bloodstream obviously straight away and can go into the brain almost immediately. So that's for this type of acute emergency setting care, and intravenous infusion is the best form or best route of administration for this drug.
What's the next step?
Yeah, so we've just activated hospitals across the country to start this, what's known as this phase 2 clinical trial. So it's probably worth pointing out to your listeners that this drug has been in development for over a decade at the Perrin Neuroscience Research Institute and the University of Western Australia. So it's had a huge amount of research that has gone before it. Mm-hmm. We have tested the drug in healthy people just to make sure that it's safe, it's well tolerated, there's no adverse reactions. And so now this second phase of that clinical trial development is to, for the very first time, test this drug in people presenting to the emergency department with a confirmed ischemic stroke. So that we're looking to recruit 92 patients into that study. And the main aim is, again, just to make sure the drug is safe. So in neurological conditions in drug development, we really need to make sure that the drug does no harm to these patients, that it is safe. And then secondary to that, we'll look at if the drug is actually working. Is it hibernating those brain cells? Is it reducing that brain injury following stroke as well in these patients presenting to emergency departments across Australia?
Dr. Liz Dallimore is a neuroscientist and CEO of Perth biotech company Argenica Therapeutics, who are on the verge of a world-first treatment for stroke patients. I hope I'm not having a stroke here on the radio. Liz, thanks for your time today, and good on you for all this incredible work you're doing.
Thanks so much, Amber. I appreciate it.
Welcome to Breakfast Radio.